All right, welcome back. We're going to wrap up moral virtue as the account of the good life today. Last time we discussed Aristotle's argument for the claim that the good life is the moral life, very different approach to the good life than hedonism. But there are a lot of details left to be developed. What exactly does it mean to live a morally virtuous life? And specifically, like, what kinds of character traits count as virtues? We keep encountering this issue where, we're told, well, the best good is happiness, and we're like, well, what's happiness? Well, happiness is, for Aristotle, living the virtuous life, and you might still be like, that doesn't help me. Which things are virtues? I need to know what I should do in order to get virtue and therefore happiness. And so Aristotle has his own set of virtues that he cares a lot about. We didn't read anything about those in Aristotle. Instead, we're going to turn to a different philosopher, Confucius, for a view that I think is complementary of Aristotle, but does differ in some of the details on the nature and specification of the virtues. So, just big picture, Mencius, a Confucian philosopher, he has a very optimistic view about human nature. Certainly in stark contrast with the psychological egoist. Confucius thinks that we are indeed capable of caring deeply and being motivated by regard for other people for their own sake. Aristotle agrees with that too. Aristotle, though, thinks that the cultivation of caring for virtue and caring for morality and caring for others for their own sake is a very long and arduous process that very few people manage to achieve. Very few of us manage to become morally good. He thinks it's possible, unlike the egoist, but he thinks it's very difficult. I think Mencius thinks it's hard to some extent as well, but he's a lot more optimistic about the ability of everybody to achieve virtue if they work on it. And that's his sort of optimism about human nature. He has 4 basic virtues that we'll talk about, focusing on one of them, and then we'll talk a little bit about his views on moral development, and how it is that you take your sort of basically good human nature and turn that not just into a disposition toward goodness, but actually a robust virtue. So he makes this remark: no man is devoid of a heart to the suffering of others. So here you see his optimism at work. All of us have this ability to perceive and feel and empathize with the suffering of other human beings. And he gives this analogy or this story to illustrate this. He says, my reason for saying that no man is devoid of a heart sensitive to the sufferings of others is this. Suppose a man were, all of a sudden, to see a young child on the verge of falling into a well. He would certainly be moved to compassion, not because he wanted to get in the good graces of the parents of the child, that is, nor because he wished to win the praise of his fellow villagers or friends, nor yet because he disliked the cry of the child. From this it can be seen that whoever is devoid of the heart of shame is not human, very strong claim. Whoever is devoid of the heart of courtesy and modesty is not human, and whoever is devoid of the heart of right and wrong is not human. Now, one reading on that is that he thinks there are some people who are devoid of this innate sense of compassion, and he's saying they're not human. That maybe is what he's saying, but here's an alternative. He could also be saying there at the end that that all of us, every single one of us, has this heart of compassion in some form or another. And so there are no human beings who lack that capacity. He may not be saying that there are some of us lack it and so we're not human. He might be saying we all have it and we're all human. So what's going on with the child at the well? Well, it's pretty straightforward. I mean, I think he genuinely thinks that all of us would react in roughly the same way. I mean, he makes clear later that he doesn't necessarily think that all of us would act in the same way. Action is partly the result of having developed the right virtues, but he at least thinks that we have the beginnings of what it would take to act in order to stop suffering of another person. And that's this heart of compassion, this sort of spontaneous welling up of the feeling of, that's another human like me who has an inner life, who has, hopes, who has dreams, who can suffer, and I know exactly what that's like. And just as I want to preserve my life, I want to preserve theirs, and I want to prevent them from suffering just as I want to prevent myself from suffering. Here are the four basic emotions. He calls these germs, or they're sometimes called seeds. And the reason is that they're the sort of seed of full virtue. So last time we discussed the idea from Aristotle that I think Confucians like Mencius tend to accept, that virtue is more than any individual action or individual feeling. Virtue is rather a stable disposition or habit to feel and act in the right ways. But in order to have that stable habit, you have to have at least the capacity to feel the right emotion in particular circumstances. And Mencius here is saying that we all have that basic germ or seed, that emotion. And corresponding to each of the basic kind of emotions is a potential for a full-fledged habit or virtue. He says this: the heart of compassion is the germ of benevolence, or ren; the heart of shame, of dutifulness, or yi; the heart of courtesy and modesty, of observance of the rites, or li; the heart of right and wrong, of wisdom, or ji. For a man possessing these four germs, he says, that is, these emotional capacities, feeling of shame, feeling respect, and feeling of embarrassment toward having disrespected someone, the heart of right and wrong, having a moral compass, and crucially, most importantly for him, the heart of compassion, which is the basis of all the others, which is the sense of, I identify with that other person. For a man possessing these four germs to deny his own potentialities, for him to not grow those into full virtues, is for him to cripple his prince. I think it's prince and not principle. Yeah, in any case, that's either prince or principle. I think it was an autocorrect. My bad. I think that should say prince, not principle. Okay, so if compassion is this stable disposition to feel empathy or compassion in a stable way toward potential victims of suffering, and for that emotion to move you to action in a reliable way, how do you get from just having the welling up of the feeling when you see the child about to potentially endanger themselves? How do you get from that to acting on it, being brave enough to try to save the child, or caring enough to actually move yourself into action? Sometimes that's easy. In that kind of case, maybe it would be with the child at the well. But what if the child were drowning, and there were drowning in a river, and there was a clear, strong current, and you can swim, but you're not a great swimmer, and you don't know whether if you jump in, you might lose your life too? Then it's going to be much harder. How do you take that germ of compassion and turn it into, I'm going to act and try to help? Here, Mencius has some practical advice about moral development. He is relating this discussion he has with the king. And it's an interesting story. So he says, Someone asks him, how virtuous must a man be before he can become a true king? He becomes a true king by bringing peace to the people. This is something no one can stop. Can someone like myself, this is actually the king here speaking, can someone like myself bring peace to the people? Yes. How do you know that I can do that? I heard the following from Hu-Hi. And he relays this story. The king was sitting in the upper part of the hall, and someone led an ox through the lower part. The king noticed this and said, "Where is the ox going?" The blood of the ox is to be used for consecrating a new bell, he's told. Spare it, the king says. I cannot bear to see it shrinking with fear, like an innocent man going to the place of execution. In that case, should the ceremony be abandoned? The person leading the ox asks him. That's out of the question, so says the king. Use a lamb instead. And then Mencius asks, this is an interesting story that someone told me about you, the king. Is it true? And the king's like, yeah, that did happen. I did stop that ox from being taken because I heard its bellows and saw it suffering. And Mencius uses this story. He asks the king, like, what was going through your mind? And the king says, it was simply because I could not bear to see it shrink with fear, like an innocent man going to the place of execution, that I used the lamb instead. Mencius then asks, if you were pained by the animal going innocently to its death, what was there to choose between an ox and a lamb? Like, why were you willing to let the lamb be led to its death? And the king laughed and said, what was really on my mind, I wonder? It is not true that I grudged the expense, but I did use a lamb instead of the ox. I suppose it was only natural that the people should have thought me miserly. And people are like, he picked the cheap animal. Mencius replies, there's no harm in this. Yeah, this is a natural thing that you did. It is the way of a benevolent man. You saw the ox, but not the lamb. The attitude of a gentleman toward animals is this. Once having seen them alive, he cannot bear to see them die. And once having heard the cry, he cannot bear to eat their flesh. That's why the gentleman keeps his distance from the kitchen. So then Mencius finally concludes, should someone say to you, I am not strong enough to lift 100 chin, but not a feather. I have eyes that can see the tip of a fine hair, but not a cartload of firewood. Would you accept the truth of such a statement? Somebody says, I can lift 100 chin, which I think is a measurement of weight, but I can't lift a feather. Would you accept that? The king's like, well, no, of course not. That would be nonsense. And then Mencius says this, why should it be different in your own case? Your bounty is sufficient to reach the animals, this oxen. Yet the benefits of your government fail to reach the people. That a feather is not lifted is because one fails to make the effort. That a cartload of firewood is not seen is because one fails to use one's eyes. Similarly, that peace is not brought to the people is because you fail to practice kindness. Hence your failure to become a true king is due to a refusal to act, not an inability to act. So what's going on here? What's the point of this story of the oxen, and what is he trying to say? Well, what you can see is a kind of potential progression, right? Mencius is calling the king's attention to this natural reaction he had at seeing the suffering of this animal that was brought in front of his eyes, and he heard it, and he saw it, and he realized, I know what suffering is, and of course I have different capacities than an oxen, but I know that an oxen's suffering probably is a bit like mine in this regard. It's physical pain and it's fear. And I can't stand to let it pass by without putting that to a stop. But Mencius then is kind of pointing out, it's odd that you then, were like, just get an animal that I didn't see. Just get one that wasn't in front of me. I mean, I think when we, in our everyday lives, when we think about the way we approach animal suffering, It is true that whether you think meat eating is ethical or not, very, very few of us want to see videos of factory farms or of animal abuse that takes place in factories where meat is processed and produced. That's horrifying, and that's part of why something like PETA uses those clips in their videos to promote veganism and to advocate for the abolition of factory farms and animal cruelty, is because they know that we naturally have this reaction to seeing those images. But then when we go to the grocery store and we see a piece of, a piece of flesh from an animal that we wouldn't have been able to imagine sitting down and just watching the video without feeling revulsion, we pick up the ground hamburger and don't even think about it, right? And it's because it's out of sight, out of mind. And what Mencius is calling us to do is notice that this, at the end of the day, whatever your ultimate verdict on the animal suffering question is, it is irrational of us to feel compassion only for things that come in front of our faces, when there are all sorts of other sources of suffering that are exactly the same, that are just invisible to us, and over which we may have a similar amount of control. In this case, the king decided, just get an animal that I didn't hear, that I can't hear. So Mencius is inviting him to first sort of notice that he should be feeling compassion for the lamb if he's feeling it for the oxen. There's no difference rationally between the two. But then the final point is, if you manage to notice that and begin to feel compassion toward the lamb as well, then all the more you should start to notice other sources of suffering in the world, specifically of your own people. And if you felt so compelled to act to prevent the suffering of the ox, and you can't feel yourself compelled to act to prevent the suffering of your people, then begin that process of noticing that the similarities in suffering are so great as to render it irrational for you to think one of these I must act on and the other I'm just gonna not worry about. So Mencius is recommending a process of moral development, a taking of the seed of the natural feeling of compassion and cultivating it so that the king, and for us he recommends as well, that same feeling occurs more strongly, more frequently, and toward more things. Mencius says this is what's called the process of extending benevolence. Mencius said, "For every man there are things he cannot bear. To extend this to what he can bear is benevolence. If a man can extend to the full his natural aversion to harming others, then there will be an overabundance of benevolence. Among babes in arms, there are none that do not know to love their parents." That's very natural. Treating one's parents as parents is benevolence. Revering one's elders is righteousness. So if you can do that, you're on your way. He then says this, "There is nothing else to do but extend these to the world." So your natural feeling of love toward your parents and your natural feeling of wanting to respect elders and certain sources of authority that you trust, we all experience that as humans. And Mencius's advice is to recognize that it's kind of an accident that we ended up feeling those feelings toward the two people who are our parents, but not everyone else. That's just an accident. If we're being rational, we should notice the reason I care about them is because ultimately I've gotten to know them as people. And I see qualities in them that, to some extent, reflect human qualities that maybe I have as well. But every human being has something like that. And so I should begin the practice of trying to feel those same feelings, as difficult as that may be, toward those who are outside my family. And eventually his advice is to the whole world. So this is a fascinating and challenging, I think, view of what moral virtue consists in. I think it's worth questioning and thinking about, what would it actually be like to do this, to take Menges's advice seriously and successfully extend your natural feeling of compassion to the whole world. Like, it's a nice thing to say in the abstract, but what if a person actually did that? I mean, it would be radically transformative. Think about how different your life would be. And then ask yourself, would that be a desirable life? Would it be one that you would choose for yourself, for your children, for your friends, for some other loved one? A life in which you are so compassionate toward everyone that you're moved to act to prevent any suffering that you possibly could encounter. Susan Wolf, I think, one way of understanding her piece is a challenge to that radical understanding of moral virtue. And she doesn't necessarily say that that's not virtuous. She does seem to think, yeah, that would be what sort of full, perfect virtue would consist in. It would be that radical. It would be using your every waking moment to extend your compassion toward others and act to prevent their suffering. That would be moral sainthood, as she calls it. But her claim is that that would be terribly undesirable, and certainly not the good life.